everyone, welcome to this week's episode of A Different Atheist Reads. Last Thursday, I mentioned I needed more time to prepare the lecture, and what I have in front of me is 56 slides that we're going to get through. So what I think I'm going to do is record this and put it as a two-parter, and I'm going to put out part 2 as soon as I can after part 1, like hopefully within the next 12 hours, the day or whatever, and basically give you a double episode and then take next week off, because this was a lot of work and I've got a lot of content. So you have a choice. You can watch half the part 1 now and then watch part 2 right away and you'll have everything, or you can watch part 1 and then wait till next week and wrap it up. Either way, I'm getting you 2 episodes, so enjoy them how you will. What I'd like to do today is present a synthesis of information that I think is relevant to Karen's chapter. A lot of this is going to come from the Yale lecture series on the New Testament that I mentioned last time, but other parts of it is also just the accumulation of 15 years of me being interested in early Christian theology and that time period. So what I'm going to be doing here is not just parroting information from a source or redoing a lecture I've already seen. Instead, I'm constructing my own arguments from the spectrum of sources that I've encountered. And every assertion that I'm going to be giving you will be backed up by evidence, and either it will be textual evidence or it will be a scholar who's written a book on it that I will provide links for. So I want to be very clear and transparent about what my evidence is and where it comes from. As I said in the last video, the setup today is that I'm going to take the position that the idea of an historical Jesus is the most probable explanation of all the evidence we have. So in terms of my imagined opponent, if it were someone who was going to argue that there was never a Jesus and he never existed, then what I would ask that person to do is, of the points I'm going to put out, where is the evidence you see to support your position that a non-existent person is a reasonable conclusion based on the evidence at hand? In this video, I will present evidence about the attributes and nature of Jesus and how they changed in what I see as a progressive direction over the decades. I will then also present why I think that this progressive Christology is evidence for an historical Jesus. And in the course of this video, I will direct questions to mythicists, and by that I mean those people who take up the position that Jesus is purely fictional. First, what do I mean by an historical Jesus? This is obviously something we need to define early on in order for me to be clear about what I am defending here in terms of being the most reasonable conclusion. And what I think happened is the most reasonable conclusion is that a man named Yeshua, who came from the Galilee and lived in the 1st century CE, gathered a sect of Jewish followers. He himself was Jewish. He preached Judaism in the early years of the 1st century, and he was eventually captured or arrested and killed by the Romans for sedition or treason. So in my mind, Jesus is as much an historical figure as the Buddha, even though there are a lot of myths and legends attached to him, or other people like Alexander or Socrates. So obviously, though, this does not mean I think he had supernatural powers. I don't. I just think he was a man who maybe people thought he had supernatural powers, and maybe even he believed he had supernatural powers, but just believing something doesn't make it true. So I don't accept anything supernatural about Jesus, just that there was a man in history who preached to these people who became his later followers and the missionaries. What I'm going to do in this video is give an exegesis of the canonical texts that we have about Jesus. Now, exegesis just means a critical explanation or interpretation of a text, particularly religious texts. The time period that I want to cover is from 40 CE to about 120 CE, so we're only going to get up to John's Gospel in this lecture, and I'm not going to engage with any of the non-canonical texts. I will talk about Gnosticism in the next section. The questions that I'm going to ask of each of these texts is kind of basic. How does the author treat Jesus, as if he was a real person or not? And given the depiction of Jesus and the things the author says about Jesus and the claims he makes, is it plausible that he thought it was a real person? Does it match the characteristics of the theology that a real person would do these things? Or does it, and I'm not going to take up the how would it make sense if he didn't exist? Because I don't think it makes sense if he didn't exist. So that's why I'm defending the historical position. In Karen's book, that she goes over a lot of different ideas about Jesus. And I want to do it, but again, I'm going to do it from my own perspective. So when I talk about progressive Christologies and the historical Jesus, I'm not going to start with the Christian writings. We're going to start with the Jewish writings and monotheism and Jewish mythology. Then I want to look a little bit at Daniel and how the introduction of the apocalyptic notion of God's actions in the world was rising in the first century Jewish thought that would have been around Jesus, and we can actually see in the Gospel of Mark as being cited, the abomination of desolation. I also want to present you a diagram on Christologies so that we can, as we move through this lecture, plot out the various forms of Christologies or Christologies that people have and which texts map onto which debates. And you'll see that there's really just two main divisions. There are people who thought Jesus was always human, and there are people who thought he was human and divine. So those are the two kinds of opinions that people have about Jesus' messiahship. Those are the two axes on which they all fall. Then we're going to look at the pre-Pauline texts, so the texts that are not in Paul's letters but seem to have originated even before Paul became an apostle, because he cites passages that explain a theology that contradicts Paul's theology. So in his letter to the Romans, he certainly seems to be reciting a prayer that would be in common, so that means it preceded him. I then want to look at Q, and insofar as historians have been able to identify what passages are in Q, I want to look at whether or not we have a lot of miracle stories and magic and supernatural things happening in Q, or if we have sayings or a mix of those two things. Then we're going to look at Mark, Matthew, Luke, and Acts and 1, and John, and then we're going to be done. To review from chapter 2, with the exclusion of the Gospel of John, really all of the other authors of the Gospels and Paul's letters that are authentic were either Jewish, or they accepted Jews were bound by the law, that Gentiles weren't, but Jews would culturally engage in Jewish practices because that's their practices. When you read the Gospels and when you read Paul's authentic letters, and probably his inauthentic ones too, but I'm just dismissing those because they're not authentic, we see a lot of mythology in them. But it's fundamentally, I would argue, Jewish mythology that is contained within these texts. So let's put ourselves back in the Jewish mindset we saw in the last chapter, just to remember what the Jewish beliefs about Yahweh were. We saw in chapter 2 that the overarching theme of ancient Jewish worship is the otherness of Yahweh. Right? God was other and humans were profane, and that's common, right? We tend to use the word profane negatively, but here it just means not holy. We saw how there were special rituals of purity where the degrees of purity needed to approach the presence of God increased and were higher and raised, and actually there were certain times of the year that were the most holy that you would use to actually go into the presence of God. So clearly there's this massive division. While Yahweh is holy and immortal and eternal, humans are ordinary, mortal, and sexual. So these clear differences exist between beings. We do have, let's say, a little vestigial tale of perhaps some possibility of interbeing relationships back in Genesis, where there's this one throwaway line about like angels coming down and having sex with women, but that's never picked up on in the rest of the text. I think there's one mention of it in David when they talk about the Nephilim or something, but really there are the roots in Judaism for the notion of human and divine beings through reproduction existing, at least the seed of it. But over thousands and thousands of years, no one picks up on it, and it's still not picked up on. That's why we point it out, because it's so weird. So we saw that there is this very clear distinction between the holy and human. We also saw that the ritual purity laws are not about hygiene, and they're not about sanitation. What they are in the practices, when you look at it from an anthropological perspective, it's about sex and death. So discharges from the genitalia or being near someone who is dead. All of these were considered, again, reminders of what human beings were not. They were not eternal. They were not asexual. They are sexual, dying, mortal beings. So the ritual purity laws were really designed to get people closer to the state of God, because we're not. It is other. So it's an emulation. It's not a union. The other thing I want to say about the Jewish texts themselves that we should remember is that the authors who are writing them were like a cult of Yahweh. They were the most fundamental, religiously conservative guys around. I kind of think of them as being the Pat Robertsons of their day. They're always moaning on about how everybody's sinning and you've got to, give your heart to God. And if you don't, he's going to rain down, terrible floods and judgment upon you. And these were the right-wing kind of like religious fundamentalists of their day, trying to get people who were Jewish practitioners of their religion to stop engaging in idolatry. So the whole motivation, one of the themes that comes up again and again in the Jewish texts is idolatry is terrible, and there is only one God, and it's Yahweh, and you have one way to worship him. This is the appropriate way. And we know that there were a lot of Jews out there who were practicing what's called syncretism, which was a union, a blending of religions. Or they would dabble a bit in Jewish stuff and they would go and do idol, just cover the bases and do some stuff to Baal and other people too. And we know this because the authors keep banging on about how bad this is and how much God doesn't like it. So I'm not saying those practices, those synchronistic practices, weren't happening in the culture. Clearly they were. What I'm saying is the people who were following the texts of these fundamentalist Yahwehists, the exclusionary Yahwehist cult, wouldn't be doing those things. They couldn't be doing those things. It's actually fundamentally against their teachings to be tolerant and incorporate a lot of pagan ideas into their religion. The last thing I want to talk about is the idea of Jewish mythology. And I want to point out there is a vast amount of Jewish mythology that the authors of the text had access to. We had mythical people who were mistakenly assumed to have been real. So in terms of like a mythical Jesus versus an historical Jesus, I think there's no evidence at all to support an historical Moses or an historical Abraham. I am looking at the text, they just read like they're myths. You don't know where he died and his gravestone is lost. And there's no physical events that you can actually go visit to tie to these people. So even though they're clearly mythical, the authors of the Jewish text believe they were real people. They talk about them as real people. They attribute authorship to them. Jesus said that Moses wrote, the Torah, which clearly cannot be true. So we have all of these characters, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Adam, and all of the ones that go along with it. We have the mythical events, the Genesis, flood, Exodus, giving of the law, the establishing of the covenant, and these kind of ritual, mythological, cultural, religious ideas that were floating around and available to the authors of the Christian texts. The other thing that we should remember are the number of miracles that are performed in the Jewish scriptures. You have Moses, who is controlling the water and parting the water of the Sea of Reeds. You also have the water coming from the rock. You have him feeding the multitudes, right? God, they're like, we're hungry, and Moses has a miracle, and they, all pick up foam off the ground or something. It's manna. Then you've got Elijah doing 16 different miracles. In the case of Elijah, you've got food miracles, you have resurrection miracles, calling fire from the heavens, parting of the Jordan, being caught up in a whirlwind. So these mythical ideas can be traced back to the Jewish texts. So now that we have this mental mindset that we can use to approach the first century when these texts are starting to be written, Yahweh is divine and other, idolatry is intolerable. We can read the text as being by and preferred, being of and preferred by Jewish fundamentalists and the people who won't tolerate idolatry. And everything about the Jewish culture that we see puts it out of step with its pagan neighbors. Its beliefs were exclusivist. They had their own distinctive and clothing rituals. They had special rights to practice monotheism under the Romans. They can kind of see them as being in the pagan world, but not of it. The last thing I want to mention before we move on to our analysis is Daniel and the book of Daniel and its influence and importance in understanding the apocalyptic nature of the message of some of the Gospels. Daniel was clearly a popular text in the early Jesus movement. The Gospel of Matthew and Mark both use the term the abomination of desolation, which is from the Daniel explicitly. In the first century, we see evidence that there were a lot of different Jewish responses to the Roman occupation, some violent, some religiously revolutionary. And we have evidence that there were people who believed that a military revolt wasn't the answer, but that God would intervene miraculously in human history and send in angels or heavenly host down to Jerusalem and create a new city after defeating Antiochus and establishing a new kingdom in Israel. That's basically where you get the story of that. It's from Daniel. I said that was last. There's one more thing. I just want to mention that another reason why I think an historical Jesus is quite probable is because there were a lot of other failed messiahs before him and after him. So we have a whole bunch of guys in the first century who believed that they were the Messiah. There's a guy named Simon, about the 4th century BCE, a former slave who rebelled and was killed by the Romans. There was another one, I think it's Rognus, who was a shepherd who became a leader of a rebellion. He was eventually killed by the Romans. There was Jesus, who was in the Galilee. He was killed by the Romans. There's Judas of Galilee, who around 6 CE led a violent resistance to the census, and that revolt was crushed by the Romans. There's another person called Menhem, I think, the grandson of Judas of Galilee. He was actually killed by one of his own men, so he's sort of the outlier. There's someone called, I think it's called Thetis, a Jewish rebel of the 1st century who at some point got a lot of followers, and he was killed by the Romans. And another guy named John, who is from a place I can't pronounce, sometime after the 70s. And he was also paraded, in this case, he was paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, so he was defeated by the Romans. So Jesus is pretty typical as far as messiahs go. Now that we've highlighted influences on the Pharisees and Judaism, the Jewish mindset, the idea of apocalyptic powers of God coming down, and also the idea that there are a lot of failed messiahs around, we can start to look at the Christologies. And a Christology is simply anything that concerns the details of Jesus' ministry, his acts, and his teaching, and trying to present an idea of who he was and what his role was in salvation. So now I'm going to show you a slide that I've created that shows you the big axis between the two kinds of areas where we had beliefs of Christology. There's one which is the human axis, and then the other one is really the interesting one. And on that one, I've got it broken up into two camps: a man who became divine, or was Jesus always divine? And you can see on the man who became divine, there were 3 different opinions on when he became divine. When he died, was resurrected, and then ascended into heaven, and he became divine on his ascension. There were other passages in the Bible where it seems to indicate that Jesus became divine at his resurrection. And we have the Gospel of Mark that shows that there was no pre-existent Jesus. He becomes divine at his baptism. So we'll go into more detail on those. On the other one, we've got when did he, Jesus was always divine, so if he was always divine, when did he emerge? There's the idea that he was born and then became divine, or he always existed and took a human form. The last bit there on human and divine and human appearing as divine is going to be the difference between orthodoxy and Gnosticism. So let's go. The question I want to ask after every section is, what does the text say about Jesus, or what view of Jesus does the author present? And then ask, given the view, does the interpretation make sense if the author was convinced there was an historical Jesus? So the challenge I would issue then for each of these points for mythicists would be the same. Does the interpretation make sense if the author was convinced there was no historical Jesus? The first people to believe in Jesus were Jews. So Jewish Christians would not have thought that Jesus was divine because that is incompatible with their belief systems. But we have a lot of evidence that there were Jews who thought Jesus' messiahship was compatible with Judaism. So according to Alistair McGrath, the Jewish Christians affirmed every aspect of then contemporary Second Temple Judaism with the addition of the belief that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, or the Messiah, right? And we have evidence of this in Acts when Paul goes to Jerusalem, and there's a rumor he's been teaching against the law, and he's forced to actually engage in Jewish laws and go to the temple. Acts 21:12. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law." And they are told about you that, you're telling people not to walk in the customs of Moses. So clearly the Jewish movement is the initial movement that starts from the Jesus movement off. And so we're going to put the pre-Pauline bits over there in the human camp. In terms of historicity check, is it possible? It's completely, obviously we have evidence that it was possible to be a human male and a Messiah and not be divine. That's kind of like actually what the Messiah is supposed to be when you look at Judaism.